Today is Tuesday, December 30th, 2025, and the time right now is 9:52 a.m. here in Araquém, Cedonia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. Today, we're doing this the disciplined way. No vibes, not slogans, not internet theater. We're doing definitions, history, and receipts, because that's the pattern you keep seeing online. People claim they have evidence, and then they hand you a meme. People claim they're the party of facts, and then they circulate AI images and recycled hoaxes. People lose an argument, and instead of refuting it, they try to silence it. So here's the standard for this show. We separate facts from attitude. We track sources, chains, and context. We test claims like adults. And sometimes, like today, I'm not even asking you to take my word for it. I'm putting the argument on the stand. You listen like a juror. And as we go, keep 3 questions in your head. Did they represent the claim accurately? Did they attack the argument or the person? And who showed receipts, facts, examples, logic, and definitions versus who relied on insinuation and moral posing? All right, let's get into it.
Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go. Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go.
Today is Thursday, December 25th, 2025, and the time right now is 5 p.m. here in Araquém, Cedonia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. Today's segment is different because instead of me telling you what I think, I'm putting my own work on the stand. I submitted my book, The Unmaking of an American Citizen, to be debated. Not reviewed, not summarized, debated. That means arguments. That means pushback. That means someone trying to poke holes in it and someone defending it. And you get to listen like a juror. Here's what I want you to do with this. Don't listen like a fan. Don't listen like a hater. Listen like an adult. Ask 3 simple questions the whole way through. 1, did they accurately represent what the book actually says? Because a lot of people criticize books they haven't read by attacking a version that exists only in their imagination. 2, did they attack the argument or did they attack the author? Because if all you hear is labels and vibes, not substance, you already know what you're dealing with. And 3, who showed receipts? Who used facts, examples, logic, history, and definitions, and who relied on insinuation, moral posing, or cheap slogans? Now let me be clear about something. A debate like this is useful even if you disagree with me, because disagreement doesn't scare me. What I'm trying to do is create a culture where people can hear an argument, test it, and respond intelligently instead of just screaming at each other like trained monkeys. If you think the book is garbage, fine. But here's the rule. You don't get to call a book crap if you haven't read it. That's not criticism. That's just you advertising that you don't read. And if you listen to this debate and decide I'm wrong, good. Tell me why. With specifics, with arguments, with evidence. Because if you can't do that, you're not debating, you're performing. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to play the debate. I'm going to let it stand on its own. And then I want you to weigh in. Was the book worth buying? And who won the debate based on arguments, not emotions? Drop your answers in the comments, and if you want me to respond, write it as a question, because I'm pulling viewer questions during the week and answering the best ones in future segments. All right, let's get into the debate of the unmaking of an American citizen.
Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on, well, arguably the most profound social and economic reordering in modern American life. We're talking about the collapse of that post-war liberal consensus model. The framework built around a male breadwinner and a largely domestic wife, and its replacement by an intense focus on individual autonomy, on career, and deeply revised family structures. The transformation was just incredibly swift, dramatic, and irreversible. And the central lingering question is whether this revolution was a success or a failure. Specifically, did the institutionalization of second-wave feminist ideas, especially those concerning work, reproduction, and the legal definition of marriage, did it fundamentally succeed in delivering genuine freedom and equality for American women, or did it primarily accelerate a kind of class fracture and family precarity, all in the name of what were often highly elite ideals? I hold the former position. I'm going to argue that these changes were a morally necessary and ultimately successful liberation, securing genuine economic independence for women who had been previously confined.
And I come at it from a very different perspective. I'll be arguing that while, yes, liberation was the stated goal, the institutional changes that were enacted fundamentally weakened the core stability of the American family unit for the majority of citizens. And in doing so, they deepened a pre-existing class divide. By prioritizing market-based participation and professional ambition, these policies, I think, effectively devalued and destabilized essential traditional vocations, leaving many non-elite families structurally fragile.
To understand why this revolution was so necessary, we really have to look honestly at what came before it. The older system, despite offering material stability to some, it fundamentally confined women. Betty Friedan described this experience as the problem that has no name. This pervasive restlessness and feeling of emptiness, particularly among educated women whose potential was just capped by the domestic role. This wasn't merely a lifestyle choice. It was a structure that limited economic and personal capacity. So the institutional changes were, they were absolutely essential to securing what we define as freedom as capacity. And that's the difference between freedom as simply being left alone, non-interference, and freedom as the actual ability to act on your desires, which of course requires economic and political power. The feminist movement understood that to protect a woman from coercion, she needed genuine economic independence. And we achieved this through landmark reforms. Think of Title IX, which prohibited sex-based discrimination in education and any activity receiving federal funds. That didn't just open up sports teams, it fundamentally redirected billions of dollars toward female academic and professional opportunities. It created a critical mass of women entering law, medicine, and business. And when you couple that with securing reproductive autonomy, these victories created measurable, real opportunity and status for women in the public sphere, fulfilling that promise of individual self-determination.
I find the language of capacity and liberation persuasive on an abstract level, but I'm sorry, I just don't buy the way it played out institutionally. The policies that were adopted, often driven by a really radical intellectual critique of the family, they led directly to a new moral hierarchy in American life. Almost overnight, paid, market-driven work gained this overwhelming cultural prestige. It was defined as the hallmark of liberation, while domestic work, caregiving, and all that essential non-market labor was actively devalued and often framed, especially in intellectual and elite circles, as a symptom of internalized oppression. This shift created an incredibly unstable foundation for non-elite women. Look specifically at the institutional mechanism of no-fault divorce. It normalized the idea that marriage is a freely revisable unilateral contract, that one party can just dissolve at any time. Now, this may sound like autonomy, but when it was enacted across the country, it led to sharply rising divorce rates and increasing family fragmentation, where children grew up with what the research calls thinner support systems. For the middle and working classes, this wasn't liberation. It was the unilateral cancellation of the most important financial and social security contract they possessed. And the results created an intense class divide. The opportunities benefited women who were already highly educated and professional, while those without significant capital or skills found themselves in a much more precarious economic environment, making work a crushing necessity rather than a definition of expanded capacity.
That's a powerful argument about social stability, and I see why you emphasize the costs, but I would frame the dismantling of the traditional family structure differently. Figures like Gloria Steinem and the broader movement, they correctly identify the nuclear family structure as a profoundly patriarchal system. It placed men in financial and legal control, and it systematically trained children to accept these rigid, predetermined gender roles. This was not a structure of mutual flourishing. It was an apparatus of economic control.
Therefore, the dismantling of that rigid legal structure through instruments like no-fault divorce was necessary to secure true independence. It ensured that women stayed in relationships by choice and not because they were constrained by legal or financial dependence. Without the capacity to unilaterally exit a dead or coercive or even just an unhappy marriage, a woman is fundamentally dependent. True autonomy is impossible.
So that initial rise in divorce rates, painful as it was, represents freedom being exercised. It's the correction of years of forced cohabitation and suppressed desires. We should not mistake stability for justice.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you're defining the only measure of justice as the ability to leave. I see why you prioritize exit, but let me give you a different perspective on the actual desires of the women this revolution was supposedly liberating. This radical prescription to view the traditional family as something to be, destroyed and to build a new model on the ashes, that did not align with what the majority of women actually wanted. The historical evidence suggests they generally sought flexibility within recognizable roles, not this androgynous ideal that was being promoted by a radical elite theory. And we saw this play out politically, so clearly showing the tension between the intellectual vanguard and the majority. The central legal ambition of the movement, the Equal Rights Amendment, it was politically defeated. The homemaker revolt, led by Phyllis Schlafly, successfully mobilized women precisely because they felt ignored and threatened by that elite feminist agenda. They organized to defend the legal recognition of motherhood and the traditional rights associated with their chosen vocation against a legal framework they believed would strip away their unique status and force them into the market economy without proper protections. That political fight, it demonstrates that a significant portion of women rejected the idea that their liberation was found only through the model you're advocating.
That's an important point, that not all women accepted the terms of liberation, but the Schlafly movement, while yes, it was politically effective, it represents a rearguard action. It was focused on defending a traditional status that was already being eroded by economic forces far larger than feminism itself.
But those economic forces are precisely the problem. And this brings me back to the economic cost. You point to economic independence as this undeniable success measured in terms of professional women's achievements. But we have to consider the concurrent economic cost borne by the average American family when a massive, skilled, new supply of labor, women who previously weren't fully integrated into the salaried workforce, when they enter the market, what happens to wages, right? They're pressured downward. As the text details, for vast segments of the population, two incomes became necessary just to maintain the standard of living that one income had provided in the 1950s. So the system now requires two workers to achieve what one worker previously secured. And thus, the institutionalization of feminism often resulted in work becoming a near obligatory part of female identity, rather than a true liberation defined by capacity and choice. The women who benefited were those who became partners in law firms. The women who were hurt were those whose husbands' wages stagnated because they now competed against a far larger pool of labor, forcing the wife into the market, not for self-actualization, but simply to pay the mortgage. This was an intensification of labor for the family unit, not a lessening of burdens.
I'm not convinced by the idea that we can lay global wage stagnation at the feet of women entering the labor force. I think that line of reasoning is far too simplistic. It ignores the effects of globalization, automation, and massive shifts in financialized capitalism. The gains achieved by women are not merely cultural. They are profoundly material and have reshaped entire sectors of the economy. The movement enabled women to enter professions that were previously closed off entirely, not just the ability to get a job, but to obtain professional power and status. This led to increased incomes, dramatically higher college and graduate school attendance rates, and the growth of an entirely new professional and leadership class that has fundamentally changed the face of governance and industry in this country. And furthermore, let's be honest about the moral critique underlying the entire movement.
The core feminist argument successfully exposed that wives and mothers were sometimes, quote, not complete human beings within the confines of the domestic sphere without their own challenging work outside the home. This was a necessary cultural correction, shifting the honor code away from a suffocating domestic ideal toward one where a woman's identity could be self-determined and honored in the public sphere.
You call it a necessary cultural correction, but I'd call it the institutionalization of an elite preference that fundamentally devalued half of human experience. You can't simultaneously celebrate the shift of cultural honor toward market labor and then deny that this shift created social pressures that made staying home or focusing on domestic care a culturally and economically risky position for the majority of families. The instability we see in lower and middle income families today, where marriage rates are plummeting and divorce remains high, is the direct consequence of dissolving those shared economic and social norms without replacing them with an equally stable universal contract. Economic independence is meaningless if the economic floor has been removed for everyone.
But that floor was built on exclusion and dependence. The ultimate institutional success of the movement, the way I see it, lies in achieving a more comprehensive and robust form of justice that moves beyond simple male-female equality. We have been forced to recognize how power operates in overlapping systems. This transition required an expansion of the state's role, yes, but for a good reason. Groups like the Combahee River Collective, a foundational Black feminist lesbian organization, they articulated the essential concept that liberation has to address multiple intersecting oppressions: racism, sexism, heterosexism. They argued that those at the most intersected points have a special insight into the true nature of injustice. The government's role, as we see through the robust enforcement of Title IX and the subsequent legal and institutional recognition of complex identities, has been to enforce this new, more nuanced vision of equality and protection. This transition required the state to move from passively ignoring systemic prejudice to actively managing systemic injustice. And that leads to a much more inclusive and honest social contract.
That's a compelling argument for expansive identity recognition. But this intense focus on intersectional identity has created a profound new kind of institutional intrusion, and I worry about the costs. As older, shared social norms governing family and roles break down, the vacuum is invariably filled by bureaucratic oversight. The state's authority over the most intimate aspects of life, including the parent-child relationship and institutional definitions of personal status, has expanded dramatically. Critics point out that institutional feminism effectively weaponized the state not only by changing family law, often driven by powerful men like Governors Reagan and Rockefeller, who found it financially convenient to dissolve old spousal support obligations, but by giving the state the power to define and police how institutions must respond to identity claims. The state is now increasingly required to define who is a man or a woman and regulate institutional response to those definitions. When norms disappear, the only entity left with definitional and authoritative power is the bureaucratic state. You're replacing family stability with regulatory oversight and making autonomy contingent on the state's definitions.
But the state is required to step in precisely because private institutions and prior social norms failed to deliver equal protection and opportunity. The shift to recognizing complex identities under law is simply the inevitable progression of the core goal: ensuring that every individual, regardless of their inherited status or identity, has the capacity to define and pursue their life goals. The tensions you observe are the growing pains of a society learning to be truly just and inclusive.
I would argue those are not growing pains. They are structural fractures.
The institutionalization of feminist ideas was a moral and necessary success because it fundamentally shifted the meaning of freedom for American women. It moved us from a restrictive ideal of freedom as non-interference within a fixed, dependent role to freedom as genuine capacity securing economic independence, professional status, and the ability for women to define their own lives outside of rigid patriarchal roles. While this process created inevitable social friction and instability, particularly as traditional economic structures changed, it was a crucial, righteous step toward a deeper social justice and inclusive recognition that fundamentally altered American potential for the better.
I must conclude by returning to that central paradox. The institutionalization of radical feminist ideals delivered immense opportunities for an educated, elite minority, but it simultaneously intensified class fracture and economic precarity for the majority of women and their families. Policies like no-fault divorce and the systematic devaluation of domestic roles eroded the stability of the middle-class family structure, replacing it with a more fragile social contract that's highly dependent on the state's expanding regulatory and interventionist role. The true cost of this liberation, I believe, was the loss of stable, shared norms that provided broad, reliable social security for the average person.
What we are left with today, then, is a profound societal experiment. We have prioritized personal autonomy, perhaps at the expense of shared stability.
Indeed. And balancing that radical push for individual capacity with the necessary human requirement for stable, shared social structures, that remains the defining tension of the modern American public conversation.
Today is Thursday, December 25th, 2025, and the time right now is 5 p.m. here in Araquemes, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. If you find this segment useful, like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming segments. Now let's talk about something that should be embarrassing for anyone who claims to be the party of facts. The left keeps saying they have all this evidence against Trump. They keep telling you, we have the proof. They keep implying, any day now, the walls are closing in. And then what do they actually share? AI-generated images, photoshopped memes, recycled hoaxes, and dramatic captions that collapse the second you ask one adult question. Where did this come from? This is the pattern. They'll say evidence and then post a picture that looks like it was made by a caffeinated intern with a political agenda and a free app. And here's what gives it away every time. The lighting is wrong, the hands look like melted forks, the shadows don't match, the text is gibberish, the background looks like a fever dream, and the story behind it is always, someone on the internet said. That's not evidence, that's propaganda cosplay. If you really have evidence, you don't need AI. You don't need a fake photo. You don't need a meme with 20 emojis and a paragraph in all caps. Because real evidence has a chain, a source, a date, a document number, a court filing, a transcript, a recorded statement, a piece of reporting you can verify. That's how adults do it. But here's why they keep posting fake images anyway. Because the goal isn't truth. The goal is impact. They want the emotional hit. They want the share. They want the look at this reaction. They want a crowd to form before anyone asks questions. And that's why the second you challenge it, they shift from evidence to how dare you. They don't argue the facts. They argue your tone. They argue your motives. They argue the vibes, because vibes are all they have. Here's the part people need to understand. When someone repeatedly uses fake images to prove a point, they're telling you something. They're telling you they don't trust the public to accept reality, so they manufacture a reality that serves their politics. And if they'll do it for Trump, they'll do it for anything. Now let me be fair for 1 second. Yes, AI exists on both sides of the aisle. Yes, people across the internet share garbage. But there's a difference between random idiots online and a political culture that keeps telling you, we have evidence, while circulating images they didn't verify, can't source, and won't retract. If you're willing to spread fake visuals to win an argument, you're not a truth teller, you're a salesman. And the product is outrage. So here's your standard moving forward. If someone claims a photo is proof, ask for 1, the original source, 2, the date and context, 3, a credible outlet confirming it, and whether the image appears anywhere else besides social media. If they can't provide that, it's not evidence, it's a rumor with a filter. And if they keep doing it over and over and over, then at some point you're not watching a movement that's trying to hold someone accountable. You're watching a movement that's trying to manufacture guilt because they can't persuade you with reality. Now send in your questions during the week. Question for you. Have you noticed people getting more confident while getting less accurate? And what's the single most common sign you see that something is fake? Drop it in the comments. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Today is Thursday, December 25th, 2025, and the time right now is 6:53 p.m. here in Araquemes, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Tonight we're doing something simple and disciplined. We're going to talk about what we actually know from the Department of Justice late 2025 Epstein document release, what the redactions likely mean, why items were briefly posted then pulled, and what you should not assume from a messy, partial, redacted public dump. Because if you want truth, you don't start with vibes, you start with the process. What is this Epstein file dump? A public library or database release is not the same thing as a full case file, a full evidence inventory, a full prosecution record, or a full list of everyone investigators ever looked at. What it is, based on DOJ statements and reporting, is a curated public release where sensitive material is removed, especially anything that could identify victims. That means you're looking at a version of the record that has already been scrubbed, sometimes heavily. Why the redactions exist? Let's address the obvious first. In cases involving sex crimes trafficking, redacting names and identities isn't a conspiracy, it's a basic protection issue. Victims are not public property, and the government has obligations, legal and moral, to avoid turning a release into a doxing event. So when you see blocks of text blacked out, the first assumption should be victim privacy, identifying details, potentially sensitive investigative material, not automatically cover-up. Now, can redactions be abused? Of course they can. But you don't prove abuse by yelling. You prove it by showing inconsistent standards and selective application. The 16 items that were pulled down. This is where the DOJ created its own credibility problem. Multiple outlets reported that a set of items, commonly reported as 16, were briefly available on the DOJ's Epstein database and then removed. The explanation reportedly publicly was essentially some of that material should not have been posted in that form, especially if it risked victim identification, and it would be reviewed and reposted with additional redactions. Even if the motive is legitimate, protecting victims, the optics are terrible. Here's why. If you're going to publish, you review before you publish, because once you post something and then yank it, you just taught the public one lesson. This process is sloppy, and sloppiness breeds speculation. Not because people are crazy, but because institutions train people to distrust them when they look incompetent. What was reported to be among the pulled material? Reporting described the pulled material as including images and other sensitive items. Exact details vary by outlet, but the common thread was it was material that never should have gone public without an extra scrub for identifying content. And again, that brings us right back to the same point. If the DOJ wants credibility, it needs a clean standard and a public explanation, not a vague trust us, because trust us is not a transparency strategy. What you can and can't conclude from photos. People keep saying, but the photos scream probable cause. Slow down. A photo can support a lead. A photo can support a timeline. A photo can support a relationship, but a photo by itself usually does not prove a specific crime occurred. It can suggest, it can raise questions, it can justify further investigation, and that's a big difference. So if your argument is photos exist, therefore raids must happen, you better be ready to answer the legal follow-up. What specific offense? What specific evidence connects the location to that offense? What's the probable cause affidavit based on? Beyond it, looks bad. Because in real investigations, looks bad is not enough. Why you're not seeing names from victims in public. Now let's address your question carefully because this matters. Why aren't victims name dropping in public? There are a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with the cover-up. 1. Privacy and safety. Publicly naming powerful people can attract harassment, threats, and retaliation. 2. Trauma and exhaustion. Not everyone wants to spend the rest of their life being the Epstein case person on the internet. Legal risk. If you name someone publicly, you can get sued. Even if you're telling the truth, you can still get dragged through court. 4. NDAs and settlements. Some people may have signed agreements that complicate what they can say publicly. 5. Victim advocate guidance. Many victims advocates advise survivors to avoid public exposure, especially when media attention becomes exploitive. So silence does not equal no story. It can also mean I want my life back. And if we claim to care about victims, we have to respect that. The clean question to ask the DOJ. If you want a question that's fair, sharp, and responsible, it's this. What is your redaction standard? In writing, and who is accountable for enforcing it? And right behind it, which categories are being withheld entirely, not just redacted? Photos, recordings, grand jury material, ongoing investigative leads, and what's the legal reason for each category? That's how you pressure an institution without turning yourself into a rumor machine. My take, the DOJ's stated rationale, protecting victims, makes sense as a principle. But the execution, posting, and then pulling items signals a review failure. And that failure creates the exact environment where everyone argues about politics instead of facts. And if they want trust, they need transparency about the transparency. Questions for you. Send me questions during the week. I'll pull the best ones into upcoming episodes. Here are 3 I want you to answer. 1. What redactions do you consider reasonable in a case like this? 2. Should there be an independent review process for disputed redactions? 3. Do you trust the DOJ to balance transparency and victim protection without politics? Drop your answers. And if you want my long-form research-driven work, my books are listed through Super Gringo Books. Start with the ones you know I cite constantly: Bloodstained Banner, Dismantling the Republic and the American Left from Liberalism to Despotism. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Today is Friday, December 26, 2025, and the time right now is 5:41 p.m. here in Araquém, Cedonia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. I want to explain something you'll notice in every one of my videos. I put the day, date, and time right at the top. And no, that's not the time I hit record. That's the time I wrote the script, because that's when the information comes in. That's when the details are fresh. That's when I'm reading, verifying, organizing, and building the argument. Then I can record at my leisure. That's not a gimmick, that's an accountability feature. It tells you exactly when the thinking happened, not when the camera happened. And in a world where people constantly recycle old clips, old headlines, and old narratives like they're breaking news, I want you to know what I'm working from. If I write something at 9:10 p.m. on Sunday and record it Tuesday, you still know the foundation was built Sunday night. That matters because it prevents the most common internet trick. People pretending their take is real time when it's actually reheated leftovers. Now let's talk about how I do it. I use a teleprompter, and I know some people will hear that and think it's about performance. It's not. It's about discipline. The teleprompter forces me to do 3 things. First, separate facts from attitude. I can still be direct, I can still be blunt, but the facts are the spine of the segment, not a mood swing. Second, keep the argument clean. When you talk off the cuff, you can accidentally exaggerate, skip a detail, or drift into speculation. A written script prevents that. Third, reduce opinion creep. I have opinions, everybody does, but I don't want the facts getting bent around my personality. So I write it out, teleprompter friendly, short lines, clear pacing, no rambling. That way, what you're hearing is the argument I built when the information was fresh, not whatever emotional temperature I happen to be at when I hit record. And there's another benefit. It lets me reach people who are new to the topic, because I'm not assuming you watched yesterday's clip or last week's rant or the 20 videos before this one. Each segment is written so a new person can drop in, understand the issue, and follow the logic. That's my process. I stamp the day, date, and time when the script is written, because that's when the research and organization happens. I record it later because the work is already done. And I use a teleprompter because I'm not trying to feel my way through facts. I'm trying to present them cleanly, accurately, and consistently. If you've got questions you want covered during the week, crime, courts, media, narratives, politics, policy, send them in. I'll pick the best ones and build them into upcoming episodes. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Today is Saturday, December 27, 2025, and the time right now is 10:38 a.m. here in Araquém, Cedonia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. I'm going to talk about something personal today because it ties into something bigger: reality, expectations, and the difference between living in a place and imagining a place. My wife doesn't understand why I don't want to go live in the United States for months. And I'm not talking about a vacation. I'm talking about the kind of let's go stay there for a while plan that turns into rent, deposits, car cost, higher food cost, higher insurance cost, and suddenly your savings is bleeding out every month. I've done the United States from the bottom. I've lived it. I've had the phase where you're watching every dollar. I've had the phase where you feel the stress of just existing, housing bills, inflation, all of it. And I'm not interested in volunteering for poverty again. Not for a maybe, not for a fantasy plan, not for an idea that sounds good until you do the math. Here's where it gets frustrating. She honestly believes she's going to be sending thousands of dollars back to Brazil to pay for a house. Let me say that again. She thinks we're going to go to the U.S. and somehow, after all the cost of living there, she's going to have extra money left over to send back here, like it's 1998 and the dollar grows on trees. And I'm sitting there like, have you seen rent? Have you seen groceries? Have you seen insurance? Have you seen what a basic used car costs now? People in the U.S. aren't swimming in cash. A lot of them are drowning quietly and pretending they're fine. Now here's the second part. She continually lectures me on the United States, and I'm trying to be respectful, but I'm going to say it plainly. She's never been there. It's one thing to have an opinion about a country. It's another thing to try to explain it to someone who lived there, served there, worked there, and knows the systems and the culture firsthand. You can't learn the U.S. from Instagram reels and TikTok economics. You learn it by paying a power bill. You learn it by trying to find an apartment. You learn it when your car insurance jumps. You learn it when you realize half your paycheck disappears into things you didn't even think about. And this is the difference between imagination and experience. My wife sees America like a movie. I see America like a spreadsheet. I see line items. I see risk. I see lifestyle costs. I see the trade-offs. And I'm not saying the U.S. is bad. I'm saying it's expensive. And if you go back without a plan that is brutally realistic, you can blow up the progress you already made. So here's my position. If we go to the U.S., it's because it improves our situation measurably. Not because we're chasing an image. Not because we're assuming money will magically appear. Not because we think we'll live there and still fund a house back in Brazil at the same time. I'm not doing poverty tourism. I already did the hard part. I'm not going backwards. Now, I'll ask you a question. Have you ever had somebody who has never lived your experience lecture you about your own experience? And what did you do? Did you correct them, ignore them, or finally snap? Send your questions during the week. If you want me to cover cost of living realities, immigration logistics, or the hard math behind moving back, send it in. If you want my books and projects from Super Gringo Books, just scan the QR code in the lower left of your screen. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Today is Saturday, December 27th, 2025, and the time right now is 2:11 p.m. here in Araquemes, Hedônia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Let me give you a quick update on how fragile some people get when facts show up. I made a post, I backed it up what I said, and then, like clockwork, either the post gets removed or I get blocked from posting. And I want you to understand what that means, because people love to pretend it means they won. No. That means they lost so hard they had to pull the fire alarm. This is what it looks like when someone can't argue with you. They don't counter your points. They don't address your sources. They don't refute the logic. They just reach for the only tool they've got left. Remove it, hide it, silence it. That's not confidence. That's not intellectual superiority. That's panic. It's like having a battle of wits with unarmed people, except even that gives them too much credit because an unarmed person can still think. What they're doing is this. They're trying to win by making sure nobody sees the argument at all. Because if people can read your point and then read their response, it gets ugly for them fast. And here's the funniest part. They'll scream misinformation while refusing to identify a single sentence that's wrong. They'll scream hate while refusing to explain which claim is false. They'll scream dangerous while doing nothing but protecting their own ego. If your worldview collapses the moment someone challenges it, your worldview was never strong, it was just untested. And I want to say something very clearly. If you have to block someone to keep them from replying, you didn't win the debate, you just conceded it. You looked at the conversation and said, I can't survive this exchange in public. So you shut it down. That's the whole story. Now, if you're watching this and you've ever wondered why public conversations are so bad right now, this is why. Because the loudest people online aren't the smartest. They're just the most protected. They don't debate, they don't moderate, they don't persuade, they remove. They don't prove, they censor. And this is why I keep pushing people to read, research, and actually learn how to argue. Because once you can think clearly, you recognize this behavior instantly. So here's my question for you. If someone is so sure they're right, why do they have to silence dissent to protect their position? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've got questions you want covered during the week, media censorship, narrative control, argument tactics, send them in. I'll pick a few and cover them in upcoming segments. If you want my long-form work, my books and projects are listed through Super Gringo Books. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Today is Saturday, December 27th, 2025, and the time right now is 3:15 p.m. here in Ariquemes, Hedonia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Let's talk about one of the laziest moral scams on the internet, calling people racist for saying, stop killing each other. Here's the question that exposes the whole game. When someone says, hey, can we reduce violence in black communities? Why is this the automatic response from the loony left? Racist! Because if you label the message as racist, you never have to deal with the message. And the message is simple. It's not ideology, it's not politics, it's not talking points, it's basic humanity. Less violence means fewer funerals. Less violence means fewer mothers burying sons. Less violence means fewer kids growing up traumatized. Less violence means fewer broken neighborhoods. So let's be clear about what's actually happening. If a group is calling for black people to stop killing each other, they're saying Black Lives Matter enough to protect. But the people screaming racist at that message, they're not defending black people. They're defending a narrative. Because the narrative is more useful to them than the solution. They need the problem to remain unsolved because the problem is their fuel. They monetize outrage. They farm attention. They recruit followers by keeping people angry and hopeless. So when someone steps in and says, no, this can get better, they panic because hope is dangerous to grifters. Now watch the manipulation pattern. They take a call for safety and morality and they reframe it as blaming victims. They pretend that acknowledging violence is the same as hating people. And then they act like the only acceptable conversation is one that avoids responsibility completely. That's not compassion, that's sabotage. And it's not anti-racism, it's a soft bigotry of low expectations. It treats black people like they have no agency, no responsibility, and no ability to improve outcomes, which is insulting, dehumanizing, and unbelievably patronizing. Here's the adult position. You can acknowledge real historical injustice and still say out loud in public, stop shooting each other, stop stabbing each other, stop destroying your own neighborhoods. Because saving lives is not racism. Saving lives is the point. And if your ideology requires you to attack people who want less murder, your ideology is broken. One more thing. If the loudest people calling it racist are the same people who never show up when it's time to mentor, to build, to work, to protect kids, to clean neighborhoods, to fund programs, to coach, to volunteer, then what you're watching is not activism, it's performance. So here's my challenge to anyone pushing that. It's racist line. Explain how fewer dead black bodies is racist. Explain how fewer funerals is racist. Explain how fewer children growing up in fear is racist. You can't, because the truth is simple. The people calling that message racist are the ones trying to keep black communities trapped inside a political story instead of helping them live better lives. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. If you've got questions you want covered, crime, culture, media, narratives, or how language gets weaponized and send it in during the week, I'll pull the best ones into upcoming segments. Today is Saturday, December 27th, 2025, and the time right now is 3:24 p.m. here in Ariquemes, Hedonia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Let me give you the shortest anti-racism program on earth. There are only two types of people, smart and stupid. And here's the part that ends the whole race hustle. Stupid doesn't have a skin color. Stupid comes in every shade, every accent, every flag, every zip code. Stupid is universal. It's the one thing that truly unites humanity. And once people admit that out loud, the entire racism industry collapses, because right now most racism discourse isn't about racism, it's about selling a story. It's about blaming your life on a category instead of your choices. It's about turning every failure into a grievance. It's about inventing villains so you never have to confront your own habits, your own decisions, your own laziness, your own ego. And the people pushing that narrative, they need you to believe skin color is destiny, because if you stop believing that, they lose control. Here's what smart people do. Smart people read. Smart people work. Smart people build. Smart people learn from mistakes. Smart people ask better questions. Smart people can handle facts that hurt their feelings. And here's what stupid people do. Stupid people don't read, but they have strong opinions. Stupid people don't work, but they have demands. Stupid people don't build, but they complain about what others build. Stupid people can't debate, so they label. Stupid people lose an argument, so they scream racist, fascist, bigot, and phobe, like it's a magic spell that makes them right. That's why the accusation of racism gets used the way it does. It's not always a diagnosis, it's often a dodge. It's a way to avoid evidence, avoid accountability, avoid comparison, avoid being measured by the same standards everyone else lives under. Because standards are kryptonite to excuses. And if you're wondering why the accusation gets thrown at people for saying basic things like work hard, stay out of jail, stop shooting each other, stop destroying your own community, get married before you have kids, read something longer than a meme, that's why. Because stupid people can't stand a world where outcomes have causes. They want a world where their failures are always someone else's fault. Now listen carefully. Real racism exists. It's ugly, it's evil, it's worth opposing. But the modern obsession with racism everywhere is often just a mask for something else. A refusal to admit that stupidity is the real pandemic. The reason this matters is simple. If we keep pretending every problem is skin color, we'll never fix the problems that are actually destroying lives. Illiteracy, fatherlessness, crime, addiction, laziness, corruption, and ideological brainwashing. Those are not skin color problems. Those are character problems. Those are culture problems. Those are intelligence problems. And yes, before someone freaks out, intelligence is not just IQ. Intelligence is self-control. Intelligence is delayed gratification. Intelligence is humility. Intelligence is the ability to learn, adapt, and improve. Intelligence is recognizing when you're wrong and changing course. Stupid is the opposite. Stupid is pride with no performance. Stupid is confidence with no competence. Stupid is outrage as a personality. Stupid is I feel like replacing I can prove. So here's the savage truth. When people finally accept that stupid doesn't have a skin color, racism shrinks back down to what it actually is, a fringe moral defect, instead of the all-purpose excuse for every bad decision. And when that happens, a lot of professional victims and grievance merchants are going to be out of a job. Good. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Send in your questions during the week. And if this made you mad, ask yourself why. Today is Saturday, December 27, 2025, and the time right now is 3:31 p.m. here in Araquemes, Rondônia, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Let's talk about reverse racism, and I'm going to do it with one example that makes people instantly uncomfortable. Historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. First, let me say this clearly so the comment section doesn't pretend it can't read English. HBCUs exist for a historical reason. They grew during segregation when black students were excluded from many institutions. That's real history. Now here's the question nobody wants asked in 2025. What would people say if there were historically white colleges? Say it out loud. Historically white colleges. Historically white university. You already know what would happen. The same people who defend HBCUs as important cultural institutions would have a full-blown nuclear meltdown. It would be called racist on sight. It would be called white supremacy. It would be called dangerous. It would be protested, boycotted, investigated, and likely pressured out of existence. So why can one label exist peacefully and the other label is considered evil by definition? That's the core issue when people talk about reverse racism. Because in modern politics, the rule is not no discrimination. The rule is some discrimination is allowed depending on who it targets. And if you don't believe that, run the experiment in your head. If a scholarship says black students only, it gets framed as equity. If a scholarship says white students only, it gets framed as hate. If a student group says black student union, it's celebrated. If a student group says white student union, it's treated like a 5-alarm fire. If a campus event says black-only safe space, it's called healing. If a campus event says white-only safe space, it's called segregation. That's not equality, that's a double standard wearing a moral costume. Now here's where smart people can hold two truths at the same time. Truth 1, HBCUs began because of real discrimination and exclusion. Truth 2, if we claim we're aiming for a society where race no longer determines rights, opportunities, and legitimacy, then we need consistent standards. Because when you normalize race-based rules, you don't eliminate racism, you rebrand it. And that's why the historically white college question is so revealing. It forces people to admit whether they believe in equal rules or just equal outcomes by any means necessary. And if your rule is race-based institutions are okay, but only for some races, then you don't oppose racism, you manage racism. You weaponize it, you point it where you want it. So here's the fair way to frame the question. If the moral principle is that racial exclusion and racial favoritism are wrong, then it should be wrong across the board. If the moral principle is that racial favoritism is sometimes acceptable as historical repair, then say that out loud and be honest that you're endorsing discrimination as a tool. But don't pretend you're against racism while defending a system where the label flips the moral judgment, because that's not moral clarity. That's political convenience. Now I want to hear from you. If there were historically white colleges today, what do you think the public reaction would be? Do you think it would be tolerated the way HBCUs are tolerated? And if not, why not? Send questions during the week. I'll pull the best ones into upcoming episodes. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Today is Saturday, December 27th, 2025, and the time right now is 3:38 p.m. here in Araquém, Brazil. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. I want to talk about something that tells you exactly who the racists are without anyone having to say the quiet part out loud. When I talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, I call them what they are to me, brothers. When I talk about any veteran who served honorably, I call them brother. And then, like clockwork, somebody jumps in and tries to reframe them as an emblem of racism. Not as human beings, not as patriots, not as men who fought for a country that didn't always fight for them. No, they get reduced to a political prop. So let me ask the obvious question. If I'm calling a black veteran my brother, and you're calling him a symbol of racism, who's the racist again? Because here's the difference between me and you. I see a man, I see service, I see sacrifice, I see a uniform and a mission and a life lived with courage. You see skin color first. You see grievance first. You see identity first. You see a tool for your narrative. And the Tuskegee Airmen are the perfect example. Those men fought through racism at home and still got in the cockpit. They flew, they escorted bombers, they protected other Americans in the air. They did their jobs when a whole lot of people didn't even want them in the building. That's honor. So why do people try to weaponize their story? Because if you can keep everything racial, you never have to talk about character. You never have to talk about discipline. You never have to talk about choices. You never have to talk about responsibility. And that's the scam. If everything is racism, then nothing is accountability. And you know what else? When you reduce a black veteran to a talking point, you're doing the same thing racists do, just with a different coat of paint. Racists reduce people to race. You reduce people to race. The only difference is you think your version is approved. It's not. It's still dehumanizing. It's still disrespectful. And it still reveals what you actually believe. That a person's value comes from their identity category, not their actions. So no, don't lecture me about racism while I'm showing respect. I'll keep calling the Tuskegee Airmen what they are, brothers. And I'll keep calling veterans brothers because we earned that. Now here's the question for the audience. Why do you think some people can't stand it when veterans are treated as individuals with honor instead of props for a political narrative? Send questions during the week. I'll cover the best ones in upcoming segments. I'm Shawn Armstrong. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. Today is Monday, December 29th, 2025. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. And I'm going to say something that will offend everyone equally. When it comes to politics right now, the right and the left, it's a parade of entitled idiots arguing about rights they barely understand. And what you almost never hear about is responsibility. Because responsibility is boring. Responsibility doesn't get likes. Responsibility doesn't get you dopamine. Responsibility requires adulthood. Here's the trend. The left is more prone to invent rights out of thin air. The right to health care, the right to live however you want without consequences, the right to end a pregnancy. And they talk like those are constitutional guarantees. Then the right does the same thing, just with a different list. The right to smoke weed, the right to carry a gun anywhere, anytime, the right to whatever I want because I feel like it. And both sides do the same dishonest move. They treat rights like a buffet. Take what you like, ignore what you don't. Now, let's talk about what adults know and children ignore. Rights come with limits, and rights come with duties. In a free society, you don't have my rights floating in space. You have rights that exist alongside everyone else's rights. Which means this. Your exercise of a right cannot destroy someone else's ability to exercise their rights. That's not oppression, That's the definition of civilization. And here's another point people don't like. Being a citizen doesn't mean I demand, it means I participate. You have responsibilities like obeying lawful orders and lawful process, serving on a jury when called, paying taxes, following the law, not because the government is your parent, but because the system collapses without civic duty. And yes, if you're tried and convicted by a jury of your peers, your rights can be curtailed through due process, not because the Constitution is fake, but because the Constitution assumes a society that enforces law. You want one example that makes people angry? Selective service exists for a reason, because rights aren't free. They're defended. So here's my suggestion for the professional outrage class. If you idiots talked about your responsibilities as much as you talk about your rights, real or imagined, people might start taking you seriously. Because right now, too many of you sound like toddlers screaming, mine, mine, mine. And one more thing, since you're here. If you want my books and research in one place, go to my book list page. Books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong, and pick what interests you. It's all there and it's organized for you. You can also find my titles through my author page at Clubes de Autores if you're a Portuguese speaker. And if you've got a question you want me to cover, rights, law, culture, media narratives, send it in during the week. This is Shawn Thinking Out Loud. All right, welcome back to Shawn Thinking Out Loud. It is Monday, December 29th, 2025, and the time right now is 5:50 p.m. Today's episode is going to be short, clean, and absolutely necessary because the comment section continues to function like a daycare with Wi-Fi. Let's read the first one from one of Grumpy Farmer's videos, which always attracts the finest from the loony left. You and the Super Gringo should kiss like clowns. That's it. That's the whole argument. No facts, no counterpoint, no attempt to refute anything. Just a weird little middle school flirting insult from a grown adult who thinks that counts as debate. Let me translate what that comment actually means. It means, I don't understand what you said. I can't rebut it. I don't read, so I'm going to say something awkward and hope everyone forgets I showed up empty-handed. And notice the pattern. When people have no facts, they don't aim at the argument. They aim at attention, because they're not here to win a point. They're here to get a reaction. Here's the part most people miss. These comments aren't tough. They're not funny. They're a confession. It's a public admission that the person is out of their depth, so they try to turn the conversation into a circus. And the reason they do it is simple. Negative attention is still attention. They want the spotlight without the work. They want to feel important without building anything. They want to matter without earning it. And that's why the comment section is full of people who won't debate. They perform. Now Grumpy Farmer jumps in and says, aren't you just the creative little 12-year-old? And then the original guy comes back with, I grew up some and retired from clown. Now I'm Super Gringo. Let me be clear. You don't become me in the comments like it's a Halloween costume. You don't borrow my name because you're bored. You don't slap on an identity like a sticker and pretend it makes you somebody. I didn't retire from clown. I retired from a real career. I built a real body of work, and I don't need to cosplay in comment sections to feel alive. So no, you're not Super Gringo. Now, you're a guy announcing he stopped being a clown while still doing clown things. Here's the standard for grown-ups. If you disagree with me, do this. Pick a claim I made. Quote it, refute it, bring sources, make a case. That's how adults talk. But if your best contribution is you should kiss, then you're not debating, you're honking from the cheap seats. And I'm not mad about it. I'm grateful. Because every time someone posts a comment like that, it proves my point. A lot of people aren't being informed. They're being trained to react. They don't analyze, they lunge. If you want the deep down breakdown on why this behavior has become normal and why so many people can't handle long form arguments anymore, I've got 3 reads for you. One is on how the left became poorly educated but highly indoctrinated. One is on the cognitive decline in digital distraction, what I call the homo idioticus problem. And one is on negative attention, moral outrage, and online trolling, how rage becomes personality and attention becomes a drug. I'll list them in the sources. And if you want my long-form work, my books are published through Super Gringo Books, 2 that connect directly to this broader cultural mess. Messiah, the Biden crime family. Those are in the sources too. Now, if you enjoyed this, do 3 things. 1, hit like. 2, subscribe. 3, share it with someone who still thinks clown is a personality. And I want questions from you during the week. Drop your best question in the comments. Politics, culture, media, propaganda, trolling, any of it. And if it's smart, I'll answer it on the show. Until next time, this is Shawn Thinking Out Loud.
Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go. Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let